All right, made to the home stretch. Well, I'm really glad to see other people that are as passionate about compliance and InfoSec. If you're looking for the Apache Flink talk, that's down the hall. This is compliance. But I promise I will make this a bit fun. And basically, I want to kind of cover in this talk getting a SOC 2. I think a lot of people face this challenge or are tasked with doing this. And what I find really interesting about InfoSec is when it intersects with engineering. So I'm an engineer by background and training. I've been a co-founder, a CTO, a CISO, started an enterprise SaaS company 10 years ago that we sold. I've built a neobank. I kind of led the US N26 launch. We had to build a lot of that banking product from scratch. Got a payments platform kind of off the ground. I'm now working on a security company. And what I've kind of seen in the past 10 years is SOC 2 comes up a lot earlier in companies' life cycle. Like when we were in my enterprise SaaS company, it took us 4 years to realize, oh, we should probably do this because we keep getting all this scrutiny from big enterprise customers. And then you fast forward to my last company, we started our SOC 2 day one. And we had our type 1 done by the time we were onboarding our first customer onto the platform. And that was 8 to 15 people, so really tiny organization. And what I found is that InfoSec kind of intersects these three key principles. It's what are the risks to the business, how are we going to actually run our operations, and how are we going to deliver a product to our customer in a safe way? And engineering touches all of those things. And I think as engineering leaders, there's a risk of actually implementing an InfoSec program in a way that really hurts the employee experience, and in particular, the developer experience. So if there's one thing you take away from this talk, this is what I want it to be, is you can approach a SOC 2 as a checklist. Here's 40 things Vanta says you need to get done to get your first audit, and you can check them all off. And then forget about it until you come up to 6 to 12 months later for your type 2 and go through kind of a panic. Or you can actually use your InfoSec program as a way to define how your entire company operates. And as engineering leaders, you get to influence how other functions are going to operate, especially ones that are going to intersect with your responsibilities. And I think about it as you can kind of implement an engineering mindset in a lot of these other functions. Things like we're going to document our practices and how we do our work. We're going to measure our activities, things that are actually happening and are meaningful in our organization. And we're going to try to anticipate things that could go wrong and prepare for those, so it's just not total chaos. And again, I think engineering leaders, especially in startups, you're not just responsible for code. You end up getting responsible for all IT. Maybe you're setting up Wi-Fi for the first time if you're in an office. You're certainly kind of managing all of the SaaS tools that are in there. When incidents happen, you're going to be kind of the first call. And so I kind of liken it to, you don't want to be that person that leaves a room for a little bit and comes back and everything's on fire. And the way you can avoid that and really put practical things in place is with your SOC 2. And so jump on that chance when someone decides we need to do this as a business. And if there are any community fans out there, this is, probably, in my opinion, one of the best television episodes ever created. Dan Harmon is quite brilliant. But let's first, I think there's a big misconception about kind of what is the definition of SOC 2. And that is that SOC 2 security. And that's actually not the case. There are 5 trust service criteria in the SOC 2 framework. Only one of those is security. And I think there are a lot of focus in SOC 2 around protecting data. And so certainly you're going to be looking for security tools and controls. How do we keep people from accessing things they shouldn't? How do we evaluate potential for leaking data? All those things are going to happen in the SOC 2, but just because you have a SOC 2 doesn't mean you're secure. And really what a SOC 2 happens and what happens during the audit period is that you have this set of controls, policies and practices that you've defined in your program, and you have an auditor that is looking to see if you're actually doing those things. But you control both sides of that equation. You decide what are our policies and practices. You're going to write those, you're likely going to draft some of those documents yourself. And then you're going to be implementing the controls as you see fit. And the auditor is just going to come in and say, well, we want to see some evidence that you're actually doing the things you talk about. You give them the evidence. Maybe something failed for a while you weren't aware of. This happens all the time. They'll give you a little check, like this was an exception. We saw this actually wasn't happening, even though they said they were doing it. But that's kind of what goes on during that, during the, kind of your first type 1 and then ongoing into type 2. And this flexibility is a big, big advantage. And so again, like trying to shift from this mindset of someone is going to hand me all these rules, I'm going to implement them, and now I'm compliant, to I'm going to actually build my program in a way that advertises the best practices that we're already doing. If you have a really awesome employee onboarding process. You've invested a lot of time and effort into onboarding your employees, getting them familiar with the companies, they understand the values, they're trained for the role that they're in. That's going in your HR and employee handbook, and that's going to be part of your program. And you're going to be able to show that off to your prospective customers, and your auditor is going to see you do really well there. Same thing on the tech side, right? Like you put a CI/CD platform in place day one. You don't want your engineers just like syncing code to the servers. We're actually going to have a defined process for how we build our code and deploy artifacts. Well, that's awesome because it's automatically going to run your tests. Maybe you can add some code scanning in there as you start to grow. Your deployments are very well defined and they're tagged to actual changes that you intend to make. You're going to show that to your auditor and change management, and they're going to see that you're have real control over how changes are promoted into production, and thus a lot less risk of introducing a bug or a problem that's going to affect the availability or security of your product. So these are the 5 trust service criteria. Like I said, one of them is security up there. There's also availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Something that most people don't know, you don't need to do all 5. You don't need to test to all 5 of these when you go through your first SOC 2. I usually just pick 3. And I've gotten advice from some of our audit partners that maybe avoid privacy for a while because it's actually pretty difficult. I've read SOC 2 reports where they only attest to availability. Now, I don't think that's a great audit report. But they have the badge on their website. It says they're SOC 2 certified. When their salespeople are going out there, they say, yeah, we have our SOC 2. Most people don't know. I wouldn't recommend it, but I'm saying that you can kind of, again, choose. Like you have a lot of mandate over what are we going to include in our program, and you can align that to how you see your product evolving. What is your kind of business strategy? Where are the risks that are unique to your business and your product? And what are the ideal practices that you want to instill? That becomes your information security program. And I think that can become really powerful. Now, it's not a free-for-all. There is kind of a standard set of policies that you're going to see, and you're going to want to put your behaviors and your practices into one of these categories. This is probably not an exhaustive list. I think the NIST framework largely kind of is the superset. If you're looking for kind of an external resource. I often collapse a lot of these together because they will have some overlap, or I have them combined. And then as a reviewer, like when I'm looking at someone's report, I want to see their things kind of split into these sections because that does allow me to look at different parts of their business. So I wouldn't say that you can just totally YOLO your program. There are some kind of structure to follow. But the contents of all of these you can kind of draft and make specific. I would say the other thing is there is advantage to doing it early. Now, SOC 2 is not for free. It's not a single point in time. This is something you're going to live with. It's a living program that's going to evolve with your entire company. But a lot of that kind of ongoing maintenance effort is kind of a scalar with headcount. And so when you have small headcount, what that means is that you can actually maintain a program pretty easily, probably with an existing person on an engineering side or an operational role, and they can carve out some of their time to kind of continue to maintain that program. I would say the other thing is there are certain controls that require a change of behavior, that if that behavior becomes instilled in your organization, it is going to be extremely difficult to change in the future, especially as you kind of have scaled your headcount later on. Like imagine running background checks when you already have 80 employees. Like that's not just like a lot of time and money, but that actually may impact some individuals kind of negatively. And you'll have to deal with that. Or if you do have devs that are kind of used to, pushing straight to main branch, and now you want to have kind of a PR code review, you're going to ruffle feathers. Like engineers don't like to change their ways of working once they've gotten those into habits. So again, kind of defining some of these things very early on in the organization lifecycle, I think is a really big advantage. I observed it in 26, a lot of struggle around being a very large organization trying to put more security controls in place and take away Linux from their devs because they can't put MDM on Linux. Like that incited like a lot of arguing and angst in the organization. Same thing with SSO, getting everybody to stop using their passwords, move to SSO, 1,000 employees, like virtually impossible. I don't think they did it. I don't think they got it fully done. I think the other way to kind of approach in a small company the setting up kind of what your control framework looks like is a lot of these can be very stage appropriate. And the auditor will be totally fine with that. So you don't need to go implement really robust, complex, security tools when you are 5 people. And the sophistication around controls will evolve over time. And it's totally acceptable, or in my experience, it's been acceptable to say, this is what we have now. We don't have a SIEM. We are collecting events, and we'll throw alerts into Slack, and someone will acknowledge an alert in Slack. We'll get a SIEM in a couple quarters once we've kind of matured some of our platforms, but this is what we have today. And you can kind of lay that out, and that's not like you're doing something wrong. And in fact, it's a very positive thing because it shows you're being thoughtful around what is appropriate for the company today, where is the risk in the organization, and I know that I can't live forever or operate in this mode. So some actual examples. Those are nice strategy words, but let's look at some real life examples. So identity and access control. Early stage, got a dozen people. Everybody probably has access to everything, right? Like everybody's kind of an admin in a lot of the tools. Devs are in production a lot, and that's fine. But what you end up framing it is like, well, we'll have an owner. So it's probably like the CEO or the CTO owns all the tools, but we've named them as the owner of our tools. They will be managing access. And they're reviewing, anytime we're adding 1 or 2 employees, they're kind of reviewing those access controls. So the review is happening on a regular basis. Then kind of as you grow, obviously that doesn't scale very well. You don't want your CTO spending all of his time giving people access to SaaS tools, every 2 weeks when you hire dozens of people. So you start to distribute that work to owners of tools. You'll say, okay, well, this is a product, whiteboarding tool. We'll have our head of product own this tool, and then they'll manage the access appropriate to that role. You'll bring in probably SSO and probably do kind of an effort. Let's get everything into Okta or Google Identity, and we can kind of centrally manage things by role there. And then when you do get really late stage, there is a bit of work. You build all these matrices of how do the permissions in this tool map to our roles that map to permissions in this other tool. You're kind of reviewing on a more regular basis, monthly or quarterly. Do people not have access if they're being off-boarded? Did we revoke that in a particular time? You're getting all your auth events out of your SSO and looking for exceptions there. So this is a totally acceptable way. Like I've told, yes, technically every engineer has access to production. We have 3 engineers. So you say we have 3 people that have access to production. You don't say everyone has access to production. And that sounds very like a very strong posture. It sounds like very few people have access to production, so that's really good. And the auditor is going to sign off on that. Vendor due diligence. This is becoming a bigger area of scrutiny. If you follow kind of security events, supply chain is a big attack vector these days. The number of SaaS tools that you bring in grow really, really rapidly. You'll probably have more SaaS tools than employees early on. So it's important to kind of get some type of due diligence happening when you bring in tools. It builds some good organization muscle. But again, you don't need to have a huge review process or a big questionnaire that everyone needs to fill out. Maybe you just start with a lightweight document and you just ask someone if they want to bring in a ticketing system, they want to bring in linear. Okay, let's just put some description into this document and we'll continue to maintain it. You'll probably review it on an annual basis. The executives, your CEO is probably going to just approve things and give kind of a verbal write-off or a written write-off that yes, this tool is appropriate. Then as that kind of scales out, you'll want to start to do your own diligence on vendors. You'll want to understand what is the classification for this vendor from a data sharing perspective, what do we intend to use, have a little bit more robustness in the review process for bringing on a new tool and procuring that. And then you'll want to have some kind of practice around approval escalation. Maybe some managers can approve a new tool. Maybe if it's highly sensitive data shared with that needs to be escalated into engineering or security. And then finally, late stage, the organization is going to have a real centralized vendor procurement process. Some of that is also due to contract negotiation, and you're trying to negotiate prices to save on costs. If you have a lot of very sensitive data, you may have your own questionnaire that you send out to new vendors that they need to fill out, and then someone needs to come and review. But again, this can kind of scale up from a few sentences in a Google Doc to a much more robust vendor due diligence process. And it kind of builds that mentality of, well, people can't just go pick a tool off the shelf and start using it. We have something even lightweight that we need to do to look at things before we turn them on. Change management, I love. This is one of the best parts of an InfoSec program. It's all about great engineering practices. And like I said, it's probably good for your software developers if you have unit tests when you're writing code, if you're doing code reviews, if you're tracking issues. There should be a ticket somewhere that's describing why are we making this change. And then a kind of well-defined code promotion. So it's not just things appearing in production. There's a track record and an audit record of why was this change being moved into production, and you can go back and reference that. This accelerates developer velocity as well. So you're finding places that early on you're going to get benefits outside of InfoSec and SOC2. And then, again, as you evolve and your builds and artifacts become more complex, you're going to start to do some code scanning, vulnerability scanning. You're going to want to start to link user stories, so there's a little bit more context for what was involved in this change. Maybe have some automated rollback because you'll want to be in a position if there is an error, there's an easy way to revert an error in production. And then, as that continues to evolve, you'll probably have a much more well-defined product development process where there's user stories and scoping, there's security review before triage, all the way to user acceptance testing. Maybe you have multiple environments you're promoting code through that have different tests. And maybe you're doing active scanning in your live environments as well. And so again, this is just a very nice roadmap to build kind of controls that aren't really going to interrupt day-to-day work and affect velocity early on, but then you can grow over time into things that are going to be much more sophisticated and work with a larger headcount. And like I said, I think of change management as the engineering superpower. This is really where there's a ton of overlap between what engineers are doing on a day-to-day basis and what you have to do for the SOC 2. I usually write this policy from scratch because you get stuff out of a catalog that says there should be a change review board and the VP needs to approve every deploy, and that's never gonna work for kind of a high velocity engineering team. So you just throw all that away and you say, well, we have all these automated checks and scans, and here is the manual approval when production artifact is promoted. Infrastructure as code. This is another kind of area that I've taken. If you do adopt infrastructure as code early on, one of the real advantages is that's now code that's part of your change management, and all of your infrastructure then falls into managing infrastructure is the same as managing code. So you just have this, you don't need to worry about like how do we patch our servers and how are we doing active scans and things around intrusion detection and running all these agents across all your different, so infrastructure as code combines kind of your infrastructure and change management in a really nice way where you just have one process, and it all changes the infrastructure is exactly the way as changing application code. Business continuity. This isn't something a lot of people think about early on, and it is, if you're going for that availability criteria, you're going to need to talk about incident response and business continuity, like what happens if something fails in the organization and how do we recover from it. This is a lot of more documentation, I would say, than actual practices that are happening on a regular basis. But you can start with just kind of highlighting, here are some of the key man risks, here are the roles, what people are responsible for, and we really rely on this sub-processor called AWS. If AWS goes down, we can't be really, not liable is not the right word, we're not going to be responsible for being available if AWS goes down, we're going to be down too. And you just make that very clear, and people are going to understand, your customers will understand, what is the cause for that outage. Then as you start to mature and you bring in more other roles, especially into the organization, maybe kind of a legal role, other risk and compliance roles, operational roles, if there are things on the finance side, you'll start to do risk analysis kind of proactively, and that's where every functional group is going to try to state kind of what is the risk in my sub-organization. You start to think about alternatives, like if AWS goes down, well, this is how we could move to Google Cloud, and this is roughly how long we think it would take. You define these recovery time objectives explicitly, where you say, given this business failure, we expect to be able to recover from that in 24 hours. Maybe there's a storm and half of our remote employees lost electricity in their home. Here's a co-working space, we'll move them in the next day so they can be back online if they've lost power. Those types of failures in the organization. And then, later stage, you're going to actually start to test the resilience. Go through exercises of like, let's shut down an AWS region and see what happens. Does the automated failover if you're multi-region or multi-AZ, shut down an entire AZ? You may run through a scenario where you turn off people's access to Google Drive, like you disable Google Drive for everyone and see that there are alternative means for people. You test these things with a lot of warning and preparation. You won't just do that randomly, but going through those exercises then kind of adds to this resilience, and you'll find other weaknesses. Like I reviewed an InfoSec an audit report from outsourced customer service, and so theirs was very much like physical failures. They had offices in Philippines and Texas, and so what happens if like an undersea cable gets cut and the Philippines is offline? Like, this is how we're going to move those people and those resources to different locations. And so it's very focused on continuity in non-technical areas of the business. And so I would say the other nice benefit of thinking about stage-appropriate practices and controls is that this gives you kind of this roadmap, right? Like, your policy is outlining, this is our ideal state. We have really strong identity and access management. Well, what does that mean? Again, like today, it means everybody has access. In the future, we're going to have a centralized identity directory and SSO. And so it allows you to actually outline, over a longer term, probably a year or two, of like how we see our organization scaling. And you can put into places the goals you have as an engineer as a leader of how you see those operations happening and what's going to necessitate us implementing our future state. And so it's really just a way, again, kind of internally to organize different functions, and you get that visibility across the different functions. So our operations or our customer service, they're using this tech stack today. We're going to need to implement Salesforce in 6 months. You can outline those things and make those really consistent and aware across that organization. I think the other thing that's really critical is you can identify overlap where you are actually accelerating parts of the business. It's not you're slowing things down or putting hurdles in place for people to do their work. So again, kind of going back to access management, like if you do anticipate hiring fast, it's in your interest to actually get single sign-on and all your tools implemented into single sign-on very early. Because then if you don't have that, you end up needing to hire people to manage who has access to what, they're provisioned on their first day, aware of where they are in the organization, and it's really, really painful. If you're anticipating changing the product very rapidly, you're in pre-product market fit. Like I said, automating your CI/CD pipeline really helps with that. And it creates kind of a consistency of how to deliver code. And so I really try to think about, especially early on, if I'm going to invest in making a control more mature than a Google Doc, what other benefit can this have, to improving the way that our employees are working? And then lastly, I think you are creating discipline in places that matter. So we talked about vendor due diligence. And I think people generally get annoyed when they can't just turn on a tool that they think will make them better at their job. And they have to go through this vendor process. And so it's having that abstracted from why do I need to do this into a real concrete reason. This is important for the organization for us to be running this program. And this is a key part of our program. Alleviates that a little bit. I wouldn't say it eliminates it, but it does give it a lot more justification and context than, oh, Ryan said he wants to review all of his tools before you bring it in, so go yell at Ryan. And then I think the upfront analysis is also a good discipline. Tabletop exercises are really helpful for people just being aware of what happens when things fail. We'll look at kind of incident response in a little bit. But I think that's a classic point of you're responsible as the engineering leader for the product to work. It's not working, and without a really well-defined way of how we're going to handle that, it's total chaos, right? The CEO's breathing down your neck. You have a bunch of devs that are really eager to help, but they're kind of stepping on each other's toes. The communication isn't very clear. Maybe the CEO messages as the important customers, but everybody else is in the dark. And that's just a really bad situation, and I've been in it way too many times. And I just think that's kind of what happens, and everything feels chaotic, and everything's under kind of this time pressure keg. So again, kind of putting the discipline through your SOC 2 program is kind of a way to make that a lot more sane. And then running a tabletop exercise where you're we're going to pretend we have an incident, and we're just going to run through. It can take 30 minutes. We're going to run through what our policy says. Okay, we triage this. We say, this looks like it's really critical and impacting customers. Great. Okay, we're going to have kind of someone running the communication process. Maybe call him an incident commander or champion, and he's going to coordinate all the activity. And these are the 3 people that need to be involved. No one else needs to be involved. Everybody else is going to get the public updates that we'll post in the general Slack channel. And then you kind of do that in a mock exercise, and everybody lives those roles and becomes a lot better. And when a real incident does happen, it's super smooth. It's just everybody's operating, working as expected. I got to throw some hacking in. We're engineer technical folks here. The SOC 2 does touch everyone in the organization, and I think it's really important to be upfront about that with leadership. you are impacting how everyone works. Like I said, hopefully in a positive way, in a deliberate way, but you are going to touch everyone. And so there are probably practices that you want to standardize. Like I said, already covered some of this, but the incident response is a great case study for this. With that established procedure, you just have a lot more clarity and a lot more efficiency in how you handle incidents. And if you don't internalize this, I'm sorry to say, there are going to be bugs. Your site is going to go down. It is absolutely going to happen. Tell your CEO right now. But you want to be able to react to that in a really calm and consistent way. Already covered some of the vendor procurement, but like as the lead tech person, just for whatever reason, naturally anything that touches tech falls into you. So this is going to come onto your plate of managing the tools. And so how do you want to manage it? And how do you want that to scale when you don't have time to manage it anymore? Build that into your vendor due diligence process now. And you can, this is all going to be provided to the auditor as evidence that we're going to follow this process. And you won't have the cases, or you'll be much less likely you'll have the cases where a critical employee leaves and you discover 2 months later he still has access from a personal laptop to a critical system. That's really lousy to find. And then ultimately it does allow you to distribute the responsibility. And I think that's the other thing where early on the kind of leaders, founders of the organization are pretty responsible for running the entire program, but you want to get rid of that responsibility as you bring in management layers. And you can define that in your policy. So I have been in a position, but I think it's rare you're ever in a position where you've decided as the engineering leader, let's get a SOC 2. It's probably your CEO, maybe someone on the sales side. Maybe you've just had too much pain of filling out the 300-question security due diligence that you're getting from your customers, and you're looking to kind of streamline that. But even though it's not maybe your own motivation or initiative to get the SOC 2, I like to be very involved in setting up the program. And hopefully I've shown you a few pragmatic things you can do to make that program not just run the way you want to run, but influence the organization. And when you're influencing the way people work, ultimately you're creating culture. And I think there's plenty of great cases where culture really matters in startups. They can be really stressful. And so having a really positive culture helps every employee get through the hard times. And this is just another tool in your tool belt for making that happen. And I think that that's just a much better way and sane way to look at, we have to do this thing, and it's not just a checklist of things. We're building practices and culture that we want to see exhibited by everyone in the organization. I did want to touch on the program management platforms because they're growing really rapidly. There's Vantas, Stratus, SecureFrame. There's a bunch of them out there. In my experience, they are useful if this is the first time you've set up a program yourself, or there's no one in the organization that's ever set up or run a program. They can kind of bootstrap, some of your documentation, and then provide some consultative services on working with the auditor. Usually they're sitting in between the auditor and you, or they have an in-house auditor, and so that really streamlines, the evidence collection that you need to do during audit periods. And they're getting cheap. The competition in that space is really driving down the costs, and they typically have some special deal with the auditor that is also a lower cost than if you directly went to a CPA. Of course, it's not all roses. I think they love to, especially in their marketing, advertise these timelines that you can get these SOC 2 in a couple weeks. Well, it's not going to always be the case, and it really depends on what you already have in place. If you're a blank page, it's going to take longer than 2 weeks. I'm sorry. If you have a lot of things already built, maybe you can get it done in 2 weeks. It's just a matter of putting all those into policies and engaging with the auditor. They do focus a lot on evidence automation, and I do think that that has a lot of benefits. But it's more limited than I think they advertise. Probably half of your program you can automate, I would say. I don't think like vendor due diligence, HR, employee training, some of those things are really not automatable. But what are my IAM roles and profiles look like? Am I giving star access to a lot of AWS services? They can pick that up and flag that. So those are kind of nice automations and does reduce the amount of evidence that you need to manually collect. And then I think the other downside, not specific to this, but some of these are growth-focused companies, and so a lot of hands-on support early on when you have your first engagement and get through your type 1, and then sometimes that support kind of lessens over time because they're really trying to focus on their new customers. But that's not a huge downside because you'll have had kind of the experience and you won't need as much of a high-touch service. I want to thank FinTech DevCon. I want to thank all of you for spending this time, the last session here, and hopefully had a couple insights that you can take away. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah. Yes, sir.
You talked about the program management platform. How much do they limit the flexibility you have in your policy?
Yeah, so the question is, do the programmatic platforms limit the flexibility of your policies? I haven't seen any limitations. And honestly, they're a nice sounding board. When I do want to go and heavily revise whatever their template builder is spewing out, I can get some affirmation that this is in line, or maybe there's still a gap. Yeah.
What's your recommendation?
The question was, what is my recommendation on platforms? The way I kind of think about the evaluation is services versus automation. I think some of them have really nice SaaS tools, really like a large suite of controls that they can be monitoring, but maybe not as much kind of consultative services that they're going to offer, maybe not as a closer relationship to the auditor or as much influence during the audit period, so it's up to you to kind of respond to the auditor. So I think those are kind of the way I segment, what is available out there. And so based on kind of where your needs are, I used Leica in one of my previous companies, and that was because they had a very kind of high-touch onboarding that we really benefited from with other people in the organization that weren't familiar with SOC 2. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's it. Enjoy the last keynote. Safe travels, everyone. Thanks again.